Pharma just crossed the tariff deadline, and there's one more coming before the year is out. Section 232 duties kicked in on July 31st for the biggest drug makers. A second wave hit small and mid-sized manufacturers on September 29th. And separately, the White House even teased a phased tariff plan for generics on Truth Social, though that one has not been written into formal policy just yet. 3 tracks, 3 different sets of stakes. I'm here with pharmaceutical and supply chain expert Dr. Thani Jambulingam, who's been tracking all of it. Let's break it down. Let's start with what's already happened. July 31st was the deadline for 17 major manufacturers named in Annex 3, including Eli Lilly, Pfizer, Novo Nordisk, and others, to fall under Section 232 duties. This follows the White House's April 2nd proclamation. Here's the structure. 100% is the default rate. Get a commerce-approved onshoring plan, and that drops to 20%. Pair that with a most favored nation pricing deal with HHS through January 2029, and it goes to 0. So Thani, is this tiered structure actually pulling manufacturing back to the US, or is it mostly just a lever to squeeze most favored nation pricing concessions out of these companies?
I think, the objective of 232 is primarily, at least from the US perspective, is to provide some level of national security for drugs. I mean, we rely on international supply of pharmaceuticals, and we wanted to have certain level of predictability and reduction of uncertainty in order to have our supply chain resilient moving into the future. And of course, there are other political agendas in this as well, but primarily the focus is resilience. With that said, manufacturing facilities are difficult to build, takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment and resources moving forward. And so it's a long-term deal. It's a 4 to 7 year, capital investment layout. So do you think that companies would be quick to make those commitments? Generally, not so. They are going to make commitments thinking that the political and the economic viability will continue into the future. That's a 10, 20-year kind of layout, right? I mean, they're not going to be able to make that decision just because of this one policy. But, yes, they might be interested, but at this point, it's all about price concessions. If they can get effectively good price concessions, that would be probably their first bet, then wait and see as they move forward with the capital investment. That's the way I would look at it at this point of time. Yes, the governments change every 4 years, but these investments can go much longer. And so would they think about waiting out? Here is something interesting that I thought, that the biggest markets for most of these companies is US. Think about, across the board, I looked at some FactSet data about the top 20 pharma companies. Over 50% in some cases, their market is US. I mean, the rest of the world is less than 50%, right? So this is a fairly large market where they do not want to shy away from, okay? So investment into the future and this market is critical for them? Absolutely. They're all looking for stability, meaning, is this policy consistent into the governments coming into the future, and will they all follow suit and do exactly what's needed? Because at the end of the day, it should make economic sense. It should make strategic sense. You can't force somebody's hands into creating an industry here. You need to provide the right support mechanism to make that happen. Because these companies are global. They're looking at, 8 billion people around the world, and this is about 340 million people. And how are we going to cater to the needs of the rest of the population in the world if you're a global company? So their thinking are far more, what should we regionalize? What should we bring it to US? And what we should keep it global? How about our supply chain? We still need to meet the needs of other countries. How should the supply chain be look at? And then selectively expand what they should do in US and what should they do elsewhere, whatever that makes economic and strategic sense. So that's the way I look at it.
And Tani, here's the big question. How should we measure whether Section 232 actually worked 5 years from now?
I think the key to look at that is basically that we wanted to make sure that how much of the resilience is created. What's the resilience that we could create by these policies? So assuming, are we securing our supply chain? Are we able to achieve the reshoring as much as we could to safeguard the future of the public health and outcome for the patients? And are we able to achieve concessions, price concessions? All those are the measures of success. We can't just look at like, okay, how effective is this tariff? And the tariff is more like a short-term kind of slow down kind of thing. We'll slow down the rest of the markets so that we could able to force them to focus on U.S. investments. But if we can't do this in the next 5 years, if this tariff program doesn't help in the next 5 years, it would be a problem because it's not going to show up. It's not going to pan out if others have figured out how to do this in the next 5 years. So it should be quick, but it's also have to be strategic. To answer that question, it's difficult to measure, but it's something that they have to have multiple outcomes simultaneously they have to look into.
Now, looking at the deadline that's still ahead of us, every other Section 232 covered in Porter, the mid-size and the small firms got a longer runway, 180 days instead of 120. That lands at September 29th, and the same tariff structure applies. So Tani, do mid-size and specialty manufacturers actually have the leverage to cut their own onshoring and most favored nation deals the way the big Annex 3 players did? Or are they more likely to just get stuck at the 100% default rate?
I think they may not have the resources of big companies in order to make this happen. Smaller and mid-sized companies are resource constrained. Would you put $1 into developing a new drug, or are you going to put that dollar in an investment to manufacture, right? And so for them, the trade-offs are pretty critical, right? And so it makes it difficult for those smaller companies and mid-term companies try to do those deals or investments. And they might be more focused, like the others, more on price concessions rather than going for those investments, because they need to see the strategic value of doing that. Also, if it's publicly held, you're dependent on your shareholders' value of how you're generating value by making those investments. So they got to cater to the needs of that. So yeah, they are going to have a far harder time making those decisions compared to the large ones.
Now, on the ground, what are pharma companies likely doing right now as they weigh manufacturing investment and supply chain redesign?
They got to look at the long term. They need to focus on the global implications of these decisions. As I said, they are global companies. They are looking for investments where are prudent and responsive and responsible, right? So they need to look at those in the big picture. So I think, as I said, for companies that see the future so integral to the US marketplace, they're probably going to focus on finding ways to make it happen. But for most of the others, if they are global focused, they're probably going to be resistant to that in the short run.
Now, our last piece, and this is just a proposal on social media, but you never know. There's no formal legislation behind it yet, but on July 21, a Truth Social post floated a separate phased tariff plan for generics. 0% through August 2028, then 100% for a year, then 200% after that. Generics fill roughly 90% of US prescriptions, but they're a small slice of total drug spend. Margins are already thin, and India and China dominate that supply base. Now, Tani, what's your take on this? If this is actually formalized into law, is a 2-year zero tariff window actually long enough to shift reshoring math for generics, and what could go wrong along the way?
No, excellent question. It comes down to economics. Drug manufacturing, especially generics, is all economics. The margins, the labor, the cost of goods, and the labor and the manufacturing, all should make it viable to meet the price needs in the U.S. I mean, generics, as you said, 90% of the prescriptions are generics. It has to be affordable. And how can you make it affordable if every one of these inputs potentially can go up if those manufacturing going to occur here? Like cost of goods, can stay stable, but labor is going to go up. Cost of making them can go up. Yes, we can argue, can we automate enough so that much of the labor can be taken out and the automation can take over and bring the efficiency necessary? Possible, but how consistently can we do across products, across different therapeutic agents and their manufacturing process, capabilities? So it is difficult if the economics doesn't make sense. It is difficult. It has to, so would US commit to giving a higher reimbursement rates for these products if they are made here? Possible, but they should commit to a higher price. It cannot be driven down to price where you have the middlemen who are driving the cost down to the point that it's very difficult for these companies to sustain. In some cases, there are 10, 15 generics might be entering the market, but only 1 or 2 can survive because they are the one who have the contracts with the middlemen. So it comes down to price to that point. So if we are going to play that particular model, then it is really difficult for these companies to invest and bring the manufacturing to US. That's my 2 cents, right? So it can only happen if Medicare is willing to give a better return on margins for these companies who are making the products here, and also provide the right incentives for them to continue to manufacture them here, provide them subsidies for infrastructure building and things like that, so that tools there in place in order to continue to manufacture those products. Other than that, it would be very difficult. We cannot, from an economic standpoint, from a cost standpoint, compete with countries like India and China with respect to their infrastructure and their manufacturing capability.
3 deadlines, 3 different pressure points, and still a lot unsettled. We'll keep tracking it all here on Supply Chain Signal.